2 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on National Defence, which started on Friday, May 21st, 2021. Please let me know if there's problems with interpretation so everyone can fully participate in the proceedings. When speaking, as much as a reminder to myself as anyone else, please speak slowly and clearly. And when you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute. And with regard to the speaking list, the clerk and I will do the best we can to maintain a consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they're participating virtually or in person. So we are resuming debate on Mr. Bagnall's amendment to Mr. Bazan's motion, and Mr. Baker had the floor. Go ahead, Mr. Baker.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm getting a bit of an echo. Oh, it's gone now. So thank you very much, Madam Chair. When Mr. Bagnall, just to recap, Mr. Bagnall proposed an amendment to Mr. Bazan's motion, which would require that when the committee completes its report on this current study, that Mr. Bagnall's motion proposes that it would require a government response. And I think when we left off last time, one of the things that I was speaking about was the importance of making sure that we obtain that government response because of the importance of a government response to ensuring accountability for the recommendations that are brought forward the committee. I think we've seen, we know from the witness testimony before us that sexual misconduct, sexual assault is a long-standing problem. In the Canadian Armed Forces, and it's transcended many governments. And one of the things that I'm very passionate about is that we ensure that we take the steps today, this government, this committee, others working on this, every step we possibly can to set us on a path that ensures that no matter who's elected, which party is in government, whether majority or minority, whatever the complexion of these committees happen to be in the future, this committee, Status of Women Committee, that are focused on this issue, that we institute the changes, we bring in the changes that need to be made to ensure that we solve this problem, but also that future governments are held to account for their actions on this issue. And I know that everyone at this committee may have a different view as to who might be in government next, but regardless of your views on that particular question, I think we should all agree, or we can all agree, that it's important that we put in place changes today that are sustained, but that are also and address the issue and the problem, but also that future governments are incented to continue with that work. And to me, one of the best ways to do that, not the only way, but one of the best ways to do that is to make sure that now, when this pivotal work is taking place, when we're undertaking this pivotal study, that we, of course, generate a report that makes thoughtful recommendations to government about how to tackle this problem, but also that future governments be held to account, regardless of the political stripe of that government. And I think having a government response is critical to that because it ensures that the government of today, first off, is clear about its intentions, and if those intentions are inconsistent with the views of the members of this committee, or survivors, or experts, or anyone else, then they have a chance to vocalize that, and there's an opportunity for the government to adjust its plan's course. And I think that's really important from a policy perspective, from the perspective of actually solving the problem. But I think today's government also issuing a response to this report also sets the bar for the next government and the government after that, the government after that. And so I think that's, to me, why the response is so vitally important to ensuring that we're actually able to solve this problem in the years to come, because we need this government and the next government and the government after that and every government after this, either solving the problem and when it's addressed, constantly vigilant to make sure that we're constantly making sure that sexual harassment, sexual misconduct is stamped out from the Canadian Armed Forces. So these are some of the reasons that I think Mr. Bagenal's motion is really, I think, constructive and important to tackling the underlying problem that we're trying to tackle here today, and through this study. I also wanted to highlight that, one of the things that I've mentioned before, but I wanted to come back to is, I think, there's a tremendous number of steps that need to be taken to eliminate sexual assault and sexual misconduct from the armed forces. Because it's a wide-ranging problem, because it's a complex problem, because there's a tremendous amount of nuance, and I think we've heard from a number of witnesses, experts, members of the armed forces, members like myself and others have shared the voices and the testimony of survivors. We've heard those voices and others, both in this committee and outside of this committee. And I think what I wanted to say is that because this issue has gone unsolved, not even unsolved, it hasn't been enough of a priority, in my view, for far too long. And so I think it's so important that we do everything we can as a team, as a committee, to put our shoulder to the wheel, to do everything we can. We should apply every effort to make a positive difference on this issue. And that's why I feel strongly that we need to issue this report. And I know there was some discussion at our last meeting about the fact that, well, the Status of Women Committee has issued a report. But I think that we heard at our committee here, Defense Committee, we heard from some of the witnesses were the same, but some of them were different. And we heard from them in different amounts and they answered different questions. And so I think first off, to the extent that we issue a report that echoes some of the recommendations of the Status of Women Committee, that's great. I mean, that means that there's consensus, and that just puts further advocacy behind the government acting on those recommendations. To the extent there's something different, that too adds value. And I think, given that we heard from the witnesses that we did, the caliber of the witnesses that we did, I think making sure that we, first of all, honor their contributions to this committee is important. And so I think that's one of the reasons. But I also think that because we find something different, because we have different perspectives, because we have different experiences, then I think that's something that's important to do as well. I think this is a moment where we need to put our shoulder to the wheel to do everything we can to address this problem, and not be like politicians of the past who've not done everything that they can. So I wanted to address that point, which had been raised in the last debate that we had at our last meeting. One of the things that is also, I think, critical is that our discussion be, that the report be created based on consensus. Why is that? Because that's not just democratically important. It's not just important to give weight to the report, although those things are true in my view. But I think it's important because of the complexity and the nuance of this issue that we're trying to solve, and that's going to take time. It's going to take time. Would take time in discussion between us to lock in on, align on how we articulate the problem, but also really what recommendations we want to make to government. And I wanted to highlight a few examples of some of that nuance and that perspective that I think we need to bring into our thinking when we when we write the report. Someone who I've spoken about before, who is a survivor, who has, you may recall, she's presented to the Status of Women Committee and talked about an experience that she had when trying to train cadets, and how she was mistreated and how she continues to be mistreated, but how she was mistreated when she came to provide training at the Royal Military College, and I shared with the members of this committee some of her testimony from the Status of Women Committee, and one of the things I wanted to share with you is some more of what she said at the Status of Women Committee, and these are excerpts of her testimony. She says, this is Julie Lalonde, of course. She says, I'm an expert on bystander intervention. And what I hear from bystanders all the time is, quote, I didn't say anything because it was just a comment. If he had touched her, I would have said something, but it was just a comment. It was just a joke. Oh, you know how he is. He's old school, close quote, and so on. So Ms. Lalonde goes on to say, I think it's vitally important that the very philosophy of the path, which is what we're currently calling this discussion, explain that sexual violence exists on a continuum, and the comments are directly related to abuses of power and directly related to gang sexual violence, which is happening. So I want to pause there for a moment. Ms. Lalonde was talking here about abuse of power. She refers to abuse of power. And so I think we've heard that from not just Ms. Lalonde, we've heard that from experts who've presented to this committee. I think we have a responsibility to make sure that we, as a committee, in our deliberations, consider how would we address this abuse of power. This is perhaps part of the culture change that we want to see, but perhaps there's more to it than that. I don't know. That's something that we would have to have a discussion about. But I wanted to underline this topic that Ms. Lalonde raises as important to at least part of the problem of sexual assault in the military, and I think I think it's really important that we tackle that. So again, an example of how important it is. In her testimony, Ms. Lalonde also speaks to what bystanders and how some bystanders often react when someone makes a comment, rather than and when someone makes a comment and they don't intervene or they don't act. And she talks about how that has to change, and that's another important component of this that I think we as a committee have a responsibility to tackle in our recommendations. So I think it requires significant thought, and it requires a government response. It requires the government to say, we agree with you or disagree with you, or here's how we are thinking of approaching these elements of the problem, whether that be how bystanders react or whether that be the issue of abuse of power and so on. Going on with what Ms. Lalonde continued to say at committee, this idea that we have to focus on the serious forms of violence. You cannot just focus on those without pulling back and doing that macro piece. We need to equip bystanders and to say that maybe an intervention for a comment doesn't look the same as it would for someone being cornered, but it's still an intervention that's necessary. So I just want to pause there. What's our committee's view on the role of bystanders, and what's our view on what the Canadian Armed Forces need to be doing to ensure that bystanders do what needs to be done? What's our solution? I'm of the view that if what we do with people what we do to address this so that bystanders are not just bystanders, they're helping to resolve the problem, then and to me that's critical that we address that. So to me, I think it's so important that this committee creates the circumstances where we can really think that through and tackle it, and make a recommendation on it, and hold government to account for solving that particular component, amongst others. So I wanted to highlight that as an example. There's another nuance that I wanted to highlight, and this is again from Ms. Lalonde's testimony at the Status of Women Committee. This is a segment of her testimony, of actually a response to a question from a member. She says, lastly, this is a truly intersectional conversation. As Christine has said, for adult men in this country, not children, but adult men, the highest rates of sexual assault are if they are incarcerated or if they join the military. So I'm going to pause there for a second. The highest rates of sexual assault for men are if they're incarcerated or if they join the military. And I think that just underlines how serious this problem is. And I think, and I underline that because I think it's a reminder of how bad the situation is and how we really need to focus on solving this problem, not the politics, not the headline grabbing, this problem of like what survivors, what's happening, sexual assault, sexual harassment, what's happening to victims, and what is the military doing to prevent it. I'm just going to go on to read from what Ms. Lalonde said. We need to look at this from an intersectional lens. I would also say an intersectional lens includes the fact that there's a significant amount of racism in the military. The Proud Boys were recently designated a terrorist organization. There were proud members of those groups who were also Canadian Armed Forces members. You can't talk about power unless you talk about all the ways in which power manifests itself in the military. And that includes racism and homophobia. A huge reason men don't come forward, as Christine said, is shame. Shame that's directly tied to the homophobia within the Canadian Armed Forces. You have to look at it intersectionally, and that means having all the players at the table. She goes on to talk to Veterans Affairs, Canadian Armed Forces, et cetera. So again, I share this to say Ms. Lalonde's testimony underlines that, or she's making a recommendation at the very least, that this problem be tackled in a certain way, that certain departments be brought to the table, but also that it be thought about in the context. She's talking about men here. Julie Lalonde's talking about men and how they're ashamed to come forward. And that's linked to the culture of the Canadian Armed Forces. So, and what are we going to do about that? Yes, we've talked about culture a lot. You know, many of us have spoken about the need to change culture. We've heard that from witnesses. We've heard that from experts. Mr. Spangeman and Mr. Bagnall spoken about the need to change culture on a number of occasions and offered some thoughts as to how that should happen. But this is a particular consequence of the culture. There's an element of the culture that Ms. Lalonde is speaking to with regards to the shame that men feel and why it happens. How are we going to tackle that? And so to me, I'm raising these as examples of, I'm raising Ms. Lalonde's testimony or segments of Ms. Lalonde's testimony to underline how serious the problem is as a reminder. I know we all know it's serious, but to underline how serious it is, and therefore how important it is that the focus of our work be on solving the problem rather than talking about politics. And I think And I think the best way to honor survivors, the best way is to tackle the problem. The best way to tackle the problem is to take into account what folks like Julie Lalonde and so many of others are offering us in terms of suggestions as to how that can be done, and then incorporating it in the report. And then, like Mr. Bagnall has suggested in his amendment, that we get the government to respond so that we have greater confidence, certainly the most confidence that we can contribute to, that this government and future governments will tackle the problem of sexual assault and sexual harassment in the Canadian Armed Forces. So, Madam Chair, I see others have hands up, so I will end it there for now. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you very much. Monsieur Robillard, s'il vous plaît.
Oui.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to continue along the same lines as I did last week, referring to Maya Eshler with regard to sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces. This report is of the highest importance because it allows us to have an academic insight into the issues in our armed forces, and it's also relevant in relation to Mr. Bagnall's motion, which puts the emphasis on the importance of the government's role in this issue, requiring a government response to the recommendations of this committee. And I quote, "The Deschamps report was published more than 25 years ago after the ruling of the Human Rights Tribunal, which ordered the Canadian Armed Forces to eliminate all legal barriers to the participation of women in their ranks. And before this ruling, the High Commissioner of the CAF had opposed changes, especially to that to do with the integration of women in a combat role, stating that this could undermine operational efficiency. And after the ruling, the CAF opted for a passive approach with regard to the integration of women, that which we qualified as being neutral in this article. And this approach brought about changes in the laws, but did not address the gender-based culture in the CAF, and this maintained the role of the soldier, the masculinity, and the warrior soldier, and it marginalized women. And characteristics typically associated with this, thereby obstructing the integration of women. And this attitude also contributed to the sexual violence in the CAF, an organization which is deemed to be neutral when it comes to gender. The Deschamps report and the military response that resulted represents a crucial time when it comes to the Army's position, because it pushed the Army to recognize the sexual misconduct problem and the need to change military culture. However, the High Command of the Canadian Armed Forces favored an approach based first on one of operational logic and efficacy, which represents a limited concept on gender equality and does not recognize the masculine warrior soldier. Operation Honor is a testimonial to the neutral approach, and it reduces the gender issue to ones of greater diversity. Now, this situation poses a problem because it prevents one to see the extent to which male power is that of favoring masculinity, and it remains ever present in the CAF, just as it does in other institutions, while instrumentalizing gender and diversity to operational ends. To change the military culture will require an explicit commitment with regard to the masculine warrior culture and militarized masculinity and the power relationship between gender rather than an instrumental approach, which is actually the case. And once again, it is a sign that we, as a government, as a committee, can act by making our recommendations to government and by requiring a government response. We are at the same time ensuring that there be retroaction. There are important lessons to be learned from this evolution in policies in regard to gender issues in the Canadian Armed Forces. First, changes made in 1989, such as those that were adopted as of 2015. They're the result of external pressures. Second, gender equality, defined as the neutrality of genders, did not bring about real change. Researchers, that is, feminist researchers, showed that this gender neutrality or gender challenges as a fundamental social issue dissimulates the fact of continuingly favoring masculinity and preventing profound change. It is still much too early to predict the results of the new approach. That is, strength by diversity and the honor approach, to see whether that will suffice to effect cultural change. It is nonetheless important to take into account the limits to the current approach. By defining the response to sexual misconduct as an operational issue, and by putting the emphasis on the added value women contribute, the Canadian Armed Forces are not being ambitious enough to effect a profound change in their military gender-based culture. A feminist and more in-depth examination of this evolution with regard to the Canadian Armed Forces approach and its gender-based approach is very necessary. It needs to open up to other societal actors, citizen organizations, feminist organizations, and the first progress report of the fact on the fight against inappropriate conduct recognizes the importance of interacting with partners in civil society as well as other experts. And this should include an ongoing dialogue with researchers as well as with feminist practitioners. Much as the civil society pressure doesn't seem to be enough to change the Canadian Armed Forces, it can at least highlight some of the limits to the current military approach, especially related to gender matters. And in conclusion, Madam Chair, I believe that we can draw the same conclusions as Dr. Eisler concerning sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces. Much as they date back to 2017, the text remains very contemporary. And as she said so eloquently, the changes operated in 1989 and those observed in 2015 were made thanks to external pressures. And therefore, it is our role as members of this committee to propose recommendations to the government to resolve this matter of sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces. But for these recommendations to just not be empty words, what we need is a government response. It is a simple question of responsibility and good common sense. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Robillard.
And please.
Good morning, Madam Chair, and thank you very much. And I'd like to start by thanking my colleagues, Mr. Baker and Monsieur Robillard, for their preceding interventions and their thoughtful commentary. Madam Chair, you'll correct me, but I believe it's been a month that we've spent in this meeting. We started on May 21st, as I think you reminded us a couple of sessions ago. And I think it's been a month of fulsome discussion and thoughtful reflections and revisiting of testimony. Incredibly important with respect to where the Canadian Forces are today, where they should be, and where this issue should be directed internationally as well. Other militaries that are going through the same processes or very similar processes, and I'll make more elaborate submissions in a moment. But what I wanted to say at the outset is, although we have different reflections and perspectives, Madam Chair, of what the study is all about, and also about how we should conduct our work, I think it's incredibly important that this committee remains seized with the issue of sexual misconduct. In fact, there is absolutely no way to conceive that we would somehow bring this to a close here today or in the coming days and divest ourselves of this work. This is work that will continue. It is continuing at the executive level with the leadership of the minister and his team. It's also continuing through the work of Madam Justice Arbour, who's conducting a review in parallel. But it's my very strong sense that this committee also, going forward, will need to remain invested in the subject matter. We'll need to conduct assessments and reviews of whatever government action follows. That is extremely important. We've looked at the experience of other countries that have done reviews and that have, in response to those reviews, tweaked or complemented an initial set of recommendations because they weren't working or weren't quite achieving in the most expeditious way the problems that needed to be addressed. So I think it goes without saying that going forward, the work on sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces will remain front and center for this committee. And I've said in previous submissions, Madam Chair, that there are two components to our work or to the reason why we have this work in front of us. The first component is the most important. It's the moral component, and it's the conclusion that sexual misconduct is wrong, is unacceptable. And also adjunct to that is the moral conclusion that women absolutely, unequivocally have a right to serve in the Canadian Forces and need to be protected when they choose, if and when they choose to do so. But there's also, and I think my colleague, Monsieur Robillard, made reference to this just a few minutes ago, there is an operational component to the work, and that relates to the effectiveness of the Canadian Armed Forces and its allied forces around the world with respect to sexual misconduct. If we don't take this work seriously, if we don't eliminate this this egregious practice of sexual misconduct, deep-rooted as it is, if we don't eliminate it in the most expeditious way, there will be an operational impact on the effectiveness of the armed forces. It goes to morale, but it also goes to effectiveness in the field. It goes to trust on the battlefield, trust in deployment, trust in the hallways of National Defence Headquarters in Ottawa, trust across bases and everywhere in between. And also trust in the Canadian Forces as an international partner and ally within NATO and UN peace operations and any other types of deployments involving other militaries in between. If women in the Canadian Forces can't trust their chain of command, if other militaries can't trust the Canadian forces as an ally and a partner that takes this issue extremely seriously and is in the process of eliminating it, we will be weaker as an ally in all kinds of international contexts. So this moral and this operational component really is at the center of why we're doing this work. And again, the moral component is paramount, but the operational one is one not to be ignored. And in the same vein, there is also, it's not just the threat of sexual misconduct within militaries or potentially across militaries that are working together in a partnership arrangement, be it a NATO deployment or a UN peace operation, but it's also the risk potentially of civilian populations, vulnerable populations, refugee populations that the Canadian forces and its allied forces are charged with protecting. If the issue of sexual misconduct is not eradicated, is not given the utmost priority, there is a risk that civilian populations in areas of deployment will be vulnerable to sexual misconduct perpetrated by members of armed forces that are deployed in that setting. So that is yet a third component that we need to be very mindful of. In the meantime, Madam Chair, as I've outlined in a series now of previous submissions, we've seen that numerous other countries are doing very similar work in parallel, and in some cases have in fact been able to publish follow-up reports on first rounds of initiatives and responses. And I think I indicated early on that in the course of a very quick round of research one Saturday afternoon, I was able to come up with a good half dozen of examples. I've made submissions on the experience in the UK. I've started to talk about New Zealand. I will, in a subsequent submission, talk briefly about South Africa. There are other countries like Australia and Sweden that have done this work. And given the timing of these initiatives elsewhere, which roughly coincide with ours, the last 5 years, 2015, 2016 through present, again, it is an important impetus for us because so many of these other countries have taken note of our early initiatives. It's important that we remain seized and that we remain in a leadership role and don't lag behind the initiatives that our friends and allies are doing and conducting elsewhere for the same reasons I've outlined above, the moral reason and the operational reason. And the review and analysis of the insight from other countries into the systemic nature of sexual misconduct is fundamentally to our own work. I think it would be unimaginable that this committee would simply ignore a whole host of experiences elsewhere, good and bad, and some with different approaches and different recommendations and conclusions, but equally important with respect to solving the issue in each jurisdiction, that we would simply choose not to look at that and say, well, we've got our own problems, eyes to the ground, and we lose sight of what is going on elsewhere in the world. We need to look at these examples. We need to glean from them the important insights that have been put forward in these reports. And in some cases, the insights were simply that not enough was being done, not quickly enough, a whole bunch of gaps exist, and the frustration on the part of the teams that are operating on these initiatives is as manifest as our frustration across party lines that this work is not proceeding quickly enough. So if there are lessons, if there are examples that we can impart on others, but in return also take back from others, then we should absolutely, without question, look at them. The focus in many of those initiatives has been the scope of the problem. We've heard a lot about definitions of various forms of misconduct, a tiering between physical sexual assault and rape and other forms of misconduct, including bullying, intimidation, and harassment. The search for mechanisms to achieve culture change in a more expeditious manner, mechanisms to ensure the empowerment of victims to report misconduct, accountability, the independence of oversight, the democratic control of armed forces to Parliament, to the executive, the search for data, the search for leadership on this issue at all levels of the service, be they military or civilian, and then the importance of communication and training as well. These are complex issues. There's, upon review of them, we see some general currents emerging on how this problem might be solved, and it comes to leadership and communication and independence and empowering victims to report. Some of those commonalities are, I think, now manifest and apparent to us. But when it comes to putting forward our own report, I think it is important that we are able to deliberate as parliamentarians, that we unleash the parliamentary process, which is there for reasons of its efficaciousness, of its democratic value, its wisdom in arriving at better outcomes when parliamentarians are able to get together in an in-camera setting and debate the recommendations and ideas and approaches that may be controversial, where there may be differences of views, to not limit ourselves to a single 2-minute intervention, but to really have debates, and sometimes tough debates, and potentially not reaching agreement after those debates, in which case the mechanism of a dissenting or supplementary report is absolutely appropriate and has been used frequently in the past. But we need to do the work to be able to figure out what we as this particular committee can put forward to add value. And there's been reference in a number of ways before the committee in previous sessions and this one as well on the value that we have coming from other parliamentary committees. In parliamentary custom, each committee is the master of its own destiny. And just because another committee is conducting the work does not mean that our committee or any other committee should say, we're not doing it because committee X is doing it. I think there's tremendous value, especially with an issue that's as important and profound and as entrenched as this one, that multiple lenses are used, multiple angles are used, multiple mechanisms of amplification through the democratic process of particular recommendations of testimony. Mr. Baker, just in his previous submission, made reference to the importance of bystander training, which has come up in other jurisdictions as well. That was raised at the Status of Women Committee. These insights are important, and we need to cross-fertilize them and find a horizontal way of looking at them. This particular committee is seized then not only with protecting the women who are currently serving and who have served, that's front and center, looking after the protection or finding mechanisms to protect victims, empowering victims, supporting victims all the way along. This committee is seized as much as the Status of Women Committee is seized. But without wanting to speak for the Status of Women Committee and its interpretation, which it's free to undertake, this particular committee, our committee, the Standing Committee on National Defence, is then very much seized with the governance structures of the Canadian Forces, the leadership questions, the resourcing questions, the accountability and review questions, the parliamentary oversight questions of this work. And we should make recommendations that fall into the historical role and the future role that we will play looking after the Canadian Forces and making sure that the Canadian Forces correspond to the expectation of current and former serving members, of Canadians, of our human rights framework, of our justice framework, all those things. So it is important for us to do this work. It is equally important that we look at the work that other committees are doing and making sure that we are amplifying those recommendations that they make that we feel are fundamentally important. And Madam Chair, just with respect to the government response, absolutely crucial that the government is asked for a response. Again, that creates the accountability feedback loop to this committee through which we are overseeing government action as parliamentarians, as elected members, and as members of this particular committee. So to do all this work and then say at the end, we don't want to hear a government response, in my mind, it gets us not even halfway there, because unless we push the government, and from other jurisdictions, we've seen the value of repeated reviews. In the case of the UK, there was a review conducted, and it was tight a time frame. It was 1 year, where recommendations and insights came back, and new recommendations were developed. And it's then very important for the government, for this committee, to have a way to go back to government to say, okay, you've told us X. During this parliamentary period, you've done Y, and we have taken a look, and we feel that you should also do Z, and to give the government then, through the parliamentary democratic process, the mandate or the impetus to further refine the work. This is work that will, as I said, will be ongoing. It will have to be subject to some sort of a ratchet effect where we can't backslide. We have to move our way forward, and each time a good set of recommendations is put forward that works and that's seen to be working, government needs to be encouraged to keep them in place. And those recommendations that don't work need to either be changed or eliminated or adjusted in such a way that they can precipitate the results that need to be so urgently brought about. It's not enough for either this committee or government to say, look what we've done, here's our answer, and then leave it to the wind to see if the results actually materialize. We need to stay engaged, we need oversight, and for that reason we need a continued insistence on a government response to the work that this committee generates. I think that's fundamentally important. So those two things, Madam Chair, being able to deliberate as parliamentarians in the way that we normally do, to have frank and robust debates, and yes, disagree with each other, and then ultimately our product to be put forward to government with a mandate for government to respond. Madam Chair, I'd like to go back briefly in this same vein and to do what I hadn't had a chance to do last time, which is to highlight some of the recommendations that came out of the New Zealand review. And you'll recall that New Zealand had an operation roughly similar to Operation Honor in its conceptualization, called Operation Respect. And what I had presented to the committee was a one-year review that was tabled in June 2020 by an independent team that had looked at New Zealand's Operation Respect and determined a number of things that were still missing, many of which reverberating in the same way as things that are still not satisfactory here in Canada. And they came out with, I think, a set of some 44 recommendations. I'm not going to go through them all. I think some of them are very specific to the New Zealand context, and some of them we have already debated and I think implicitly accepted in some ways. But I did want to highlight some of them for the committee's consideration and benefit before turning it back to you, Madam Chair. So the fundamental challenge that the New Zealand review identified resulted in a recommendation that the Minister of Defence of New Zealand requests the Auditor General to carry out an audit every 2 years for 20 years of the NZDF's, that's the New Zealand Defence Forces, progress in regard to Operation Respect specific outcomes, paying special attention to the elimination of harmful behaviour and sexual violence. This takes me back to the comment I made a couple of minutes ago. This is, even though the Minister says the time for patience is over and culture change needs to happen now, yes, the time for patience is over in the sense that we need to act. We need to put forward the recommendations that will bring about change. But New Zealand has framed this as a problem that will take time to solve. The most egregious behavior hopefully solved very, very quickly, but overall, their conclusion is they want an audit every 2 years for 20 years to make sure that the problem is actually eliminated, eradicated. It's a semi-generational problem. If you look at 20 years, that time span for them, but there's absolutely no possibility to backslide. So these audits, these reviews, New Zealand sees as fundamentally important. It has also made a recommendation to limit the scope of Operation Respect to two distinct streams of work, and mirroring the approach that some other jurisdictions have taken. The first being the elimination of sexual violence, which is the most egregious behavior, the most harmful behavior: rape, sexual assault, actual violent behavior, physical behavior. And then secondly, the second tier would be the elimination of discrimination, harassment, and bullying. Subsidiary behaviors, but that nonetheless stem from the same completely inappropriate culture that needs to be changed and eradicated. New Zealand also recommends that the government build collective ownership of leadership by developing a long-term strategy in collaboration with base and camp commanding officers. Using a phased approach, that strategy should build on the current foundations of Operation Respect and allow for flexibility in implementation so that each service can tailor to their culture, state of change readiness, and prioritized needs. And Madam Chair, we've had discussions on the various cultures, plural, that exist in the Canadian Forces, some of them salutary, very positive with respect to excellence and teamwork and not leaving your teammates behind, and readiness and all the good things that go with the Canadian Forces that its current and former members cherish and can be very proud of, but also the negative aspects. New Zealand recognizes that within the various branches of its forces, that there are differences, and that these differences need to be taken account of and given back to the leadership of each branch to solve. They recommended the appointment of a change communications specialist to work solely on this project in conjunction with a specialist in sexual violence, such as the head of the sexual assault and response team, to implement regular, strategic, and nuanced messaging. And we've seen elsewhere in other recommendations the importance of outside perspectives, outside expertise in change management, in communications, and other parts. The tension is always that if somebody is too far removed from the organization, they will not understand the nature of its internal problems. But if somebody is too close to the the organization itself, she or he will be captured by the organization's interests and not able to solve the problem effectively. So appointing a change specialist to work in conjunction with the existing leadership structure is New Zealand's answer to that, and they've put it forward as a recommendation. The engagement of all leaders at all levels to own the management of harmful behavior, including sexual violence, discrimination, bullying, and harassment in the NZDF. That's a foremost importance behind that recommendation, in the sense that unless there's ownership by the leadership of the behavior, there's no accountability and no prospect for change. And in Canada, obviously, we've had an experience that's very different from that of other jurisdictions, in the sense that the very head of the armed forces, the person in charge of the former Operation Honor, the person who was to be the top of the accountability chain, was then actually accused of having been part of having engaged in that same kind of behavior that he was mandated to prevent. So that's different from other jurisdictions, but nonetheless, New Zealand sees it as essential that the management at all leadership levels owns the responsibility for eliminating this behavior. They also recommend the allocation of a significant budget to develop key tools for leadership and all personnel. And here they make reference to the Respect in the Canadian Armed Forces mobile app. It's important to recognize that we need leadership, we need communication strategies, but we also need tools. And I raise this recommendation, Madam Chair, because New Zealand is in fact very closely looking at Canada and has in many respects indicated that it has taken action as a result of having reviewed the Deschamps report in 2015. So in a way, I don't want to overstate this in a sense of saying that the eyes of the world are on us, but certainly the eyes of some key allies and partners are on us. And for that reason, in addition to all the other ones I've mentioned, I think it's incumbent on us to continue to move forward and to review these kinds of tools that we have put in place, including the Respect in the Canadian Armed Forces mobile app, to see if they will serve the purposes of current members and former members of the Canadian Forces in solving the issue. New Zealand is also quite concerned about data management, so they recommend a comprehensive and integrated data management system to routinely and systematically collect data and report on complaints and outcomes of incidents of harmful behavior, including sexual violence and discrimination, harassment, and bullying. As parliamentarians, we know this. Good governance cannot happen without good data, without accurate data, properly disaggregated data, and there's been comments by colleagues on the intersectionalities of sexual misconduct, the close relationship to diversity, inclusion, its impact on members of the LGBTQ2S+ community and others. For all of this, for all these reasons, we need good data. We also need good data to see if any of the branches of the Canadian Forces are leading or lagging. Maybe there's one branch that has particular innovations in solving this issue and has come out front, and data would capture that, and then it could be a competitive race to the top and solving the issues among the other branches. There could be a constructive, competitive spirit that emerges from data that reflects positive action that actually works to resolve the issue in the most expeditious way. Other recommendations touch upon organizational learning strategies, education, communication, making sure that members of the armed forces in New Zealand are actually aware of the various options that exist, not only with respect to governance of diversity and inclusion in their branches, but also reporting. Going back to Mr. Baker's comments earlier, and he's made reference a number of times to the importance of bystander training in reference to witness testimony that the Canadian House of Commons has received through committees. New Zealand recommends the contracting of an evaluation of bystander training programs to independent assessors. Again, bystander training seems to be one of those issues that is fundamentally important in accelerating progress. They have recognized that and then say, okay, to do that, let's put an assessment process behind that and make sure that bystander training actually does what it seems to be doing in so many other contexts. Does it also work in the military? So again, monitoring of performance and reviews translate into absolutely critical recommendations that this committee absolutely must be mindful of, in my view. Conducting annual audits of the sexual assault response team to ensure that both the safety and well-being needs of the team are being met alongside those utilizing the service. That's not necessarily something we've turned our minds to yet, and I'm raising it for that reason, Madam Chair. Those teams that are going to conduct the work to eliminate sexual misconduct in the armed forces, those men and women, officers and NCOs that are part of that organizational effort are going to see some ugly things. They're going to potentially see or hear testimony. They're going to see or hear all the bad things that are going on and have gone on for far too long. And we need to make sure that those teams are looked after with respect to mental wellness. The change agents, the change managers in the armed forces are breaking down a culture that is harmful, that is insidious, that is destructive, and we need to keep them strong. Excellent recommendation. I think it's very worthwhile for this committee to take a look at it, to make sure that we look after those who look after the women and the victims of inappropriate conduct, sexual misconduct. Prioritization of the work to increase the individual personal safety factors of barracks, ablutions, and toilet facilities, a very pragmatic recommendation that looks to current operations and bases across the New Zealand Defence Forces. We could certainly match that granularity in our work and make sure that physical facilities that women of the Canadian Armed Forces continue to use are safe, are protected, and that changes are made if they're not. And lastly, Madam Chair, ensure consistent and regular communication to clarify what is and what isn't appropriate behavior, including hazing and initiation rituals, to improve consent culture and to reduce coercion and peer pressure. Communication is crucial, but we have to look all the way to the beginning of the chain of thought of somebody considering a career in the Canadian Forces, the recruitment process, the kinds of communications that she or he will receive when walking into the door of a recruitment center on sexual misconduct. And anybody who contemplates a career in the Canadian Forces at this very moment will most certainly ask herself or ask himself those questions. Is this a safe place? Yes, I want to serve, but where are we in light of the recent weeks of headlines, and where are we in light of this committee's work? Am I walking through a door where I have a greater assurance of safety? And I think it's crucial there that communication is clear to recruits that have taken the decision to join the Canadian Forces, that inappropriate hazing or initiation rituals, which really set the stage, Madam Chair, with respect to the perception of what kind of culture this is, with respect to hazing. You know, if you go through a hazing ritual, you walk away with certain perceptions that this is a place where this kind of thing will continue throughout my career, and perhaps in different and even more harmful forms. So it's an excellent recommendation by New Zealand. It takes us all the way to the beginning of the process of somebody who decides with the most noble aspirations to serve her country or to serve his country by going into a recruitment center and obtaining some information on a career in the forces. I will leave it there. I've taken you through only a segment of the recommendations. There are many more. But again, with my emphatic suggestion that this committee be seized with and turn its attention to the experiences elsewhere as a fundamental starting point, if you will, for our discussions on what has worked and what hasn't worked, and what we could borrow to make our recommendations stronger and more effective and more efficient. And potentially also, as Madam Justice Arbour's work goes forward, she also will have the opportunity to review, I would think, the work of other countries. I think it's important that we look at the systematicity of sexual misconduct as going quite a ways beyond Canadian borders, and so many other countries being seized with the same issue. If there is a best practice that emerges somewhere, it is one that should be harnessed quickly by all other jurisdictions that are involved in solving this issue, for both the moral reason and the operational reason that I described at the beginning of my submissions. Madam Chair, I'll leave it there for the moment and turn it back to you with my thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Spengeman. On to Mr. Bagnall, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And welcome to all my colleagues on the committee. First of all, I want to thank Mr. Spengeman for his continuing great research on other militaries. I think with the courageous survivors that we've had that have come forward, with the experts, and with this information from other militaries, this committee probably may now have the best report or the best information on file of any military in the world that the CAF can use, that the government can use, and Madame Arbour can use to really come up with a positive step forward. And I want to really thank Mr. Robillard too for the tremendous work he's doing on women in the military, because that's obviously a key aspect of preventing misconduct in the military. I have, of course, several issues with the motion before us, and my amendment is to deal with one of those issues. And I believe there should be a government response to the motion, to the recommendations. These are very complicated changes, which I will go on shortly about. But change is never easy, as everyone knows. Even small change can lead to resistance, let alone major changes that are needed here and in a number of militaries. So I believe there's a far better chance of these changes occurring if the government is, with their response, is part of the solution. And I don't imagine there's any committee member here that feels that there would be less chance of success on some of the recommendations that we would make if the government was not part of the solution for that. So what I want to do, I'm just going to address one item in this, my first intervention today, and that is related to culture. And to show how complicated it is, why we need a government response, because the solution is so complicated. And as I said before in the last meeting, I think I really need the experts' input because I have no expertise in this area. So I'm going to talk about what the experts have said about culture to show why it's complex, why we need the government to be part of the solution with their response. So the first input I'll talk about is from Dr. English, when he said that culture that exists now in the Canadian Armed Forces is sometimes referred to as a warrior culture. Sorry. Now, this warrior culture came into the Canadian Armed Forces in the early 2000s when we started cooperating very closely with the United States in Afghanistan. And after 2005, when General Rick Hillier became Chief of Defense Staff and wanted a warrior culture to replace what he called a bureaucratic culture that existed in the Canadian Forces at the time. The warrior culture that was chosen because of our close association with the United States was a particular culture that had been created in the US in the 80s and 90s, which was based on a hypermasculine, sexualized military culture that had actually been created to keep LGBTQ people out of the military in the United States. And later, this was deployed against women. This was an artificial, foreign, hypersexualized culture that, according to American researchers who have researched this culture, contributed to, quote, creating or sustaining a cultural environment where sexual assaults can occur and thrive. By importing this American hypermasculine culture, we created a lot of our own problems. I think one of the first things any culture change would have to do would be go back to what we put into, quote, duty with honor, our profession of arms manual in 2003, which was something called the warrior's honor. This new Canadian warrior culture in response to Somalia crisis was to be based on the warrior's honor that they would use the minimal amount of force possible to achieve their objectives, and that the warriors had a responsibility to both carry out their mission and also to respect the laws of war. This is quite different from what we have now. And I would think that's the first thing we have to change. So Dr. English then went on to explain that it's true, we have to change for the reasons I just quoted from him, but also that the Canadian military, in fact, all militaries, are in a very unique situation. And so they have to have a unique culture. And the question is, what would that culture look like given the constraints or the conditions or the environment, the unique environment of a military? So he goes on to say, the other comment I would make with this is that there does need to be a unique military culture. Canadians require very specific things from the women and men who are providing security for them. That requires some very specific things. There is no other employer who has the concept of unlimited liability that expects and requires to put themselves in harm's way. To do that, to generate those capabilities and the capacity to endure under what can be really arduous circumstances does require something unique that most private sector employers don't need. The issue is, what should that culture be? I think that's the issue is really up for debate and discussion. Again, what comments we're providing here, there's a tension in the military as well around evolving over time. One thing that is baked into the military philosophy is that there are really important lessons that have been learned that were paid for in blood over the centuries that we will never forget. That is of importance, but that can hold the military back from trying to envision a future military culture that they need to be building within a 21st century context and with young Canadians who are seeking to serve their country in uniform. It needs to be a unique culture. The debate really is about what that culture should be and what should be retained and what needs to fundamentally change. So going on to show how complex it is and why we need a government response because of the complexity, Dr. Latke talks about how women, there's some comments about certain situations women are in, but she goes on to explain how women face differences throughout their entire spectrum of their military career. They could be different aspects at different times in their career, but certainly right from recruitment to requirement, there's totally different situation for women. And that's obviously very critical in improving the military and discussions that we're having. So Dr. Latke said, I would certainly welcome the opportunity to review how we can better focus on the unique needs and experiences of women in the Canadian Armed Forces. It takes a crisis to precipitate more attention to this issue. If it takes a crisis to precipitate more attention to this issue, then so be it. In general, I think it's been a big push behind integrating a gender-based analysis tool. And again, I compliment Mr. Robillard on that for his discussion in the House actually a couple of weeks ago, his private members' discussion on gender-based analysis in the military. Congratulations, Mr. Robillard. But she says integrating a gender-based analysis plus tool into the way that Government of Canada develops its policies. And here, this certainly applies to the Canadian Armed Forces. Because the experience of women are different from men, we pointed to some cultural factors for why that is. There are other reasons as well for why they may have different needs and different experiences. At every career stage, once again, whether it's at the moment of recruitment or the moment of release and transition from being in the military to reintegrating into civilian life, women face unique challenges. If we can use this opportunity as a way to further discuss what these unique challenges and needs are, then I definitely think this would be a step in the right direction. Madam Latke goes on. At the same time, I don't think we should assume that what's going on right now, what is playing out in the media, is a central decision-making factor for women, either in terms of considering her career options in the military or whether she's considered joining the Canadian Armed Forces. There are a host of other motives and reasons why women make decisions about their careers, and that may have an impact or not. Certainly, it's not just one consideration of many. Certainly, it's just one consideration of many. 1 second. So again, to show the complexity of this one topic, culture, and why we need the government involved in a very thoughtful response to what we come up with, is I'll go to Dr. Akros. And Dr. Akros talks about one of the ways to improve this culture is make sure that everyone, all the groups, maybe underrepresented groups, et cetera, have a voice and their voices are heard. So Dr. Akros says, I'll start by saying that I'm probably the last person to speak on behalf of women serving in the armed forces. And that's the point I'd like to make. Inclusion strategies. When we are looking at diverse peoples, use the phrase, nothing about us without us. If we apply the women, peace and security agenda principles, one of the things it should lead to is a recognition that women need to be empowered to represent themselves, and that includes with agency, with voice. I would offer in terms of what the CAF does internally, that it's important to ensure that the voices and perspectives of those we wish to speak for are being heard and being considered. In the long run, creating a mechanisms of voice so that individuals and subgroups within the military can be heard effectively would be a good strategy. Dr. Akros goes on to say that the extension beyond this is an issue of creating social hierarchies. Every workplace, every group has social hierarchies of who is the most important down to who is the least important. These are things that are being policed commonly using sexualized or racialized languages and references. When people put in snide comments, when women make an observation and are ignored, and then their male colleagues say the exactly same thing and then are applauded, these are the day-to-day practices that send signals about who's important and valued and who's not. When people seek to create these military hierarchies or these hierarchies, and police them by rewarding certain individuals based on characteristics and attacking others, that's what starts damaging the identity of and belonging. It's important for us to be recognizing it. It isn't unique to the military. What I tried to identify are some facets of the military, such as the importance given to normative conformity, obedience to authority, the differentiations of rank and power differences, and these things can accentuate those and make it more difficult. And as Dr. English, in what I just reported earlier, Dr. English made the same type of reference to the specific environment of the military. As I said, these things are essential for operational effective, but they're double-edged swords because they get used against people as well. So the environment and the needs of operations has these different requirements because it's such a difficult situation. But then these different requirements, if used improperly, are part of the problem. And that's why this committee needs to have, very considered discussion of this one complicated topic of culture. It's not simple, and it'll take some time. We're going back to Dr. Latke now, and to talk about training. And she came up with a very important point that I'd never thought of before, but makes obvious sense when you think about it at length. And that what she talks about is how the training for related to sexual misconduct is totally different from operational training. It's treated far less seriously, whereas the operational training, as anyone knows that's been in operational training, is done over and over and over again until it's just gut reaction, it's instinct, and that's what saves your life in a different situation. So Dr. Latke goes on, I think we can recognize the capacity of the current culture. I want us to switch the framing from operational effectiveness to organizational effectiveness. Operation Honor frame misconduct as a problem that undermines operational effectiveness. And I think moving forward, it would be prudent to talk about organizational health. Organizational effectiveness is a prerequisite for operational effectiveness, and the way that the forces get ready for operations is through training and certification. You plan and practice until your instincts are right, and even in difficult, complex environments with high stress and sleep deprivation, you will perform in a way that is consistent with your training. On the other hand, we have Operation Honor training, which consists of passing on information about sexual conduct. It's ticking the box, and we don't worry so much about how the information is retained or applied beyond monitoring who's up to date on their training and who is not. While I fully agree with my colleagues that it's important to look at culture, I think it's important to look at culture through different phases of the career and how military identity is developed through the stages. I also really believe in the importance of some more bureaucratic fixes, and training is one of them. We need to give this kind of training as much as importance as the other types of training that happen in the military. And later on in this intervention, I'll explain how Dr. English repeats the same point. So now, once again, just to show a need for a government response to this, Dr. Latke goes on, there's been a lot of defensiveness in the past, as well as in terms of reacting to problems as they arise. And of course, 5 years ago, that's where we were as well. However, despite these doubts, I don't think we should wait until the next CDS is appointed to take decisive action. There needs to be immediate action to call to action and stress on the importance of this crisis-like situation for the people. There are a lot of people in the Canadian Armed Forces, and right now they need to hear from their leaders. The well-being of the Canadian Armed Force members, victims, and survivors is paramount. And as you've heard our members saying this a number of times in recent committee meetings, people need leadership in times of crisis. General Iyer is it right now. This is obviously needed from the PM and the Defense Minister too, but the Canadian Armed Forces members will look to their service commanders and CDS to set the tone. We spoke to deeper change and cultural change, and that's what's certainly necessary immediately. Sexual misconduct cannot always be put away as a problem to solve on its own. We've tried to really emphasize the connection between military culture and the prevalence of sexual misconduct. Then there are more immediate questions that have been raised in the last few weeks, and we need to reverse engineer this problem. The question that needs to be answered immediately is how officers get to the top of the hierarchy while abusing people. How can the incentive structure within the CAF change so the abuses of power are not explained away or covered up by subordinates, peers, or senior leaders alike? And you can see that is a huge issue that will take more than a couple of minutes of discussion and to come up with a rational, thoughtful solution as to how we deal with that. And I'll talk about that in my next intervention, not this one, but later on in the meeting. I'll talk about that promotion situation as well. But it shows that we need thoughtful discussion by committee members on that, and then a response from the government on this very complicated issue. Dr. Latke goes on, in my opinion, abuses of power have not been adequately addressed as part of Operation Honor Journey, and this circumstance should motivate a series of adjustments across the board, from training approaches to communications to leadership to data collection. And when we get on to discuss recommendations, probably not till my third intervention today, one will be related to data collection, which for obvious reasons will be important as to what levels the effects are at and how they're different. And then again, to show the complexity of this issue, why we need thoughtful discussion in committee and a government response, Dr. Akros goes on, I would just like to offer that it's important to make a differentiation between commitment and understanding. I would state that I believe leaders at all levels are committed to addressing the issues. And, all people on this committee are, I'm sure. As has been observed by women's organizations externally, the gap in understanding, as I tried to say, is at one level easy to see or easier to understand why it's difficult to understand. Again, one of the phrases people use is that it's hard for fish to discover water. It's difficult for people who are completely immersed in a very strong, dominant culture to really understand what culture is. And this is the reason, well, again, I think this is the reason for some of the calls for the assistance of those who have external academic and professional perspectives to bear to assist senior leaders in understanding the culture and then helping them to figure out what the cultural change initiatives can be. And that is why I said exactly, is the reason I said at the beginning of this intervention that myself and perhaps other committee members without experience need this expert input. But Dr. English puts sort of a caveat on that, and he says that to follow from that, one of the issues exactly about what leaders believe, General Thibault made a very perspective comment that his lack of belief in Justice Deschamps' conclusions was based on his own personal experience. He didn't see it. And we know from research that this is true, that we form biases and we tend to favor our own personal experience, for example, over academic studies. However, it goes back to this very key point, which is power. Many of the behaviors that go on, and they're not all related to sexual misconduct, are related to maintaining and keeping power. One of the main things you have to do when you want to make comprehensive culture change is to make significant changes in the leadership, and the Canadian Forces has rarely, if ever, been willing to do that. That comes down to oversight. And Mr. Baker had mentioned oversight already today. I'll make the last point very briefly about demographics. Until you change the demographics of the forces, get more women in, get more diversity, the experiences are going to remain within this homogeneous group that doesn't really believe in change. I think the leaders have said that. And you know, it's not just a few, there's a certain level that it has to be before it will be effective. So the last, just going to make one more input on this culture, again, to show how complicated it is. And it's from Dr. English, who said, I've read, and this is a good conclusion to my first intervention today, I've read the latest DAOD 9005.1 on sexual misconduct, which I've referenced a number of times actually in these committee meetings. And I find parts of it contradicts itself. I was discussing, and this is Dr. English going on, I was discussing with a colleague the other day about duty to report. On one hand, it would say that you report here, disclose here, and it doesn't get reported. You disclose here, and it does get reported. You disclose here, and it doesn't get reported at first, but maybe it will get reported later on because someone or a profession has a duty to report. For your average person, it would be quite complex to figure out exactly what's going on. I know why DAODs are written the way they are. They are written by lawyers and bureaucrats to cover all bases. For the average member, it would be quite difficult to decipher that. Going back to the culture question, that really is the substance of my arguments. In the end, it doesn't really matter how good your rules and regulations are, and I've mentioned this before, previous committee members, or how open to reporting you are. If people know within the culture that anyone who reports will be ostracized, bullied, harassed, or have their careers ended, then it doesn't really matter how good and clear your regulations are or how open you say you are. Many times, many organizations, including the CAF, have said this. Why does it go back to the fundamental problem of changing culture? I have to emphasize that my colleagues are a little more optimistic than I am about the path to dignity and respect. If it calls for cultural realignment, it's assuming that everything is not so bad. I'm afraid most people have said it's pretty bad. It needs more than realignment. It needs a comprehensive change. Until that change happens, it doesn't really matter how many rules and regulations are made about reporting, people aren't going to do it. We've had many reports done on that and have explained why. So I've just spent 24, over and above everything that's been said culture at previous meetings, I've just spent 24 minutes on intervention on this one complex issue that our committee's struggling with. So how reasonable would it be that this motion would only allow me 2 minutes? These issues are very complex. We have to come out with a thoughtful discussion of these issues, and that's only myself. So, it just shows how unreasonable the motion is that would limit me to 2 minutes when I've used 24 minutes right now, plus things, as people have mentioned, that I've said in previous meetings. So think for a minute, what would, if we were allowed only 2 minutes on the motion, and then made our recommendations to the Government of Canada, which the way the motion is right now, they wouldn't have to respond to. But the government, given that the recommendation was provided without serious debate, would have two options. First of all, they could not take it seriously because they realized that because of this unreasonable motion we're discussing, that it wasn't a serious debate on the issue, or they'd be forced to do a detailed evaluation and analysis of the recommendation to ensure that it had, that it was an appropriate recommendation. I'm glad that all the committee members, especially the opposition, have the belief that the government has the ability and the expertise to do that. But I don't really think, that would take a long time. I don't think that would really help the survivors if we cause them to take all sorts of extra time by not giving them well thought out, well debated recommendations. So that's why I believe the motion before us is not the most effective way of proceeding. And I would hope that we could have thoughtful debate and a government response to these very critical and important issues. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bagnall. On to Madame Vandenbeld, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the thoughtful interventions before me in today's meeting. Particularly, Mr. Bagnall, I noted at the very end, he explained well, I think, how complex and complicated the solutions are to these issues that we're facing in the Canadian Armed Forces right now, and how cynical the motion is, both the not wanting to have a government response to our committee report, but also the limitation of the 2 minutes per person to be able to debate issues that really require a lot more thoughtfulness. It's not obvious what the correct answers are. I think we have done a very good job of outlining what the problem is, and we know that there is a very significant problem. But the answers differ depending on who you speak to, on what perspective they bring. And we know from history that very often you can put in place solutions, you can put in place programs like Operation Honor that look like they will solve the problem and then have unintended consequences and don't achieve the results that we're looking for. So just in terms of the motion itself, I do believe that it is very cynical, Madam Chair. I have referred to it, in fact, as poison pill motions. I don't believe that there is goodwill on the opposition side to actually really want to work together in good faith to get these reports done. The fact that we are now sitting here half an hour before the end of the last scheduled meeting of this, before the summer break, really disappoints me. And the opposition members know, both in private and in this committee, and other members of this committee, Mr. Bagnall and others, we have made many overtures to try to find a solution to this impasse. And I'm certainly not going to speak publicly about those overtures, but they were done very much in good faith. I think we all want to see this report, this and the other reports. And given that we are now at this 11th hour, I think all of us feel a little bit deflated about the fact that we're unlikely to see some of these recommendations, especially the ones that matter to the survivors. And I just have to say, Madam Chair, there's been arguments that all the committee needs to do is talk about the finger pointing and who did what right and when, and talk about the politicians. And, we had, if it had been 3 meetings, if we had stuck to the original title of the motion, done the 3 meetings, had the minister here, and then reported on that would have been different. But the fact is, we then continued as a committee to call witnesses, including survivors, including professors, including experts, including people from the Canadian Armed Forces, officials, others who have been working on this throughout their lives. There are people who came for whom this is their life's work, and they have been putting forward solutions for decades. And to have those people come to this committee and give that testimony and then turn around and say, we don't need to include any of that in the report, I think is unfair. It's unfair to the witnesses. It's unfair to the survivors. It's unfair to the women and men of the Canadian Armed Forces. And, I think that it is really too bad, because I think Mr. Bagnall's proposal that he's made several times now, that we at least go through and find the things that we all agree on. And I thought that we did all agree on at least those proposals that help us move forward for the women and men in the Canadian Armed Forces. And it's becoming very evident to me now here that we don't. And, I think that putting these very cynical motions, knowing that these are motions that that we would not be able to support, such as not having a government report. I think that it could have been different, Madam Chair. It could very easily have been different. And I would just remind, the word filibuster is being thrown out a lot. I would just like to remind, particularly those who might be listening, that the opposition holds all the cards right now. At any moment in the last month, and you've heard me say many times, and you've heard others say in this committee, both privately and publicly, that if we were to have adjourned the debate at any moment in the last month, we would have gone to the next item of business immediately, which is the study of the report. And I would remind, Madam Chair, you'll recall that not only could we go to the study of the report, we were doing the study of the report. And we were actually, without saying what happens in camera, we were advancing quite well, I think. We were actually talking to each other. And somewhere along the way, the opposition has been putting these what's known as 1064 motions, which immediately ends the topic that we were talking about, and then comes in with another meeting and another new motion, and it's been one after another, and I think I can't remember the number of hours, but certainly by the time this meeting began, that we've been doing for the last month, had already been 26 hours of overtime, of time that was in addition to the times that that we were scheduled to sit. And each time we have, in good faith, we've debated it, and then we've agreed. And each time that we agree and we have somebody else come, another witness, whether it was Elder Marquez, whether it was Katie Telford, the minister for 6 hours, and then each time they come back with something else, until it became readily apparent that it wasn't about trying to get a report done. It was really about just dragging it on, and it didn't matter what we agreed to. They're just going to keep coming up with more motions. And then that became even more evident when we agreed as a committee to a certain timeline. We agreed that, and we spoke with the clerk and the analyst to see how long they would need to be able to translate and format the report and get it out and table it in the House. And we agreed to a timeline in this committee that would have allowed us to get all three reports tabled. And the opposition just blew through that timeline, again, with motion after motion, with 1064 after 1064, with all the procedural tactics. And I would remind again that, when somebody is filibustering, it generally means that they have control of the meeting. But the opposition literally at any moment could have said, move to adjourn debate, and we would have adjourned the debate, and we would have gone directly to a study of those reports without these unreasonable limits of 2 minutes to speak, and then no back and forth, no dialogue. If they really wanted dialogue about this and wanted these reports done, it is entirely, the opposition holds all the cards here. They have the majority on the committee. They hold all the cards. They have been holding all the cards from the beginning. And I just don't want there to be any doubt about, should this report unfortunately not be able to be tabled before the summer recess, which is getting less likely. I don't want there to be any doubt about who held the cards in terms of deciding whether or not that happens, and the level of effort. Myself personally, in conversations in this committee, Mr. Bagnall, who has proposed different ways beyond the impasse to build consensus. So I just, again, I just want to express my disappointment before I go into some of my remarks today. Given that it looks like we're going to continue to debate this motion and Mr. Bagnall's amendment to try to ask for a government response, which frankly is the least that we should be doing, is asking the government to respond to our recommendations. But barring that, we have heard a lot of very good recommendations that at minimum, I want to make sure they get on the record. I want to make sure they're right here on the record, in a format that at least can be picked up by the CAF, by D&D, by the government, by the minister, by Parliament, so that we actually have these here today at least. And these recommendations, I'll remind, and I've been reading through them for some time now, but these recommendations are coming from the survivors. They're coming from the stakeholders, the experts, the academics, the people who have come as witnesses before this committee and other committees and have reached out to each one of us. And I know that there are many people who've reached out personally to all of us. And so what I'll do right now, given that we are short on time, what I'd like to do is read the remaining ones that I haven't yet gotten to, and then read them all, and then I'll comment on some of them. But these are the ones that, and again, these are not my voice. This is the voice of the survivors. These recommendations were brought to us, and it's a summary. And these are the ones specifically on culture change. And this is a summary of those recommendations. And the reason, again, Madam Chair, that I'm putting these forward is because, I think it is important that in speaking to Mr. Bagnall's amendment, that we have a government response. And if it's not going to be a response to a committee report, at least we can put this on the record so that the government can look at these. So first of all, it recommends updating the path to dignity and respect to identify and reflect factors that increase the risk of workplace harassment. And Madam Chair, we've heard a little bit about the path to dignity and respect, and Mr. Bagnall actually cited some of our witness testimony that said that it doesn't really go far enough. I know that when it was put forward as an evergreen document. It was really intended to be the beginning of the discussion. And I'd note, actually, that this path to dignity and respect was put forward in October. And it was done based on, actually, at that point, some significant work, recognizing that after 4 years, 4 or 5 years at that point, that Operation Honor wasn't having the intended result. And, again, I believe that those who worked hard on Operation Honor did so believing that by, to simplify it, simply ordering this to happen, that could work. But there were some very good aspects to Operation Honor as well, and there were some successes as well, which we haven't talked about. But by and large, I think all the survivors we heard from have said that it didn't work. It didn't achieve the goal that it was intended to achieve. And recognizing that last year, recognizing that a year ago, long before the crisis, long before any of our committee studies or any of the events that have unfolded since February, the department and the Canadian Armed Forces, the minister, had already started working on how do you achieve culture change, because the recognition was that the reason Operation Honor wasn't working was because you couldn't just put in place what needed to be done. You had to also change the underlying culture. And that's what we've all been talking about in this committee. And so I think that updating the path to dignity and respect is very important, because it is the underlying intent on culture, I think, is very important. I know that there have been survivors who have come back with recommendations about it, would like to see it expanded, would like to see other things included. And the fact that we now have Lieutenant General Carignan and Madame Arbour working in this area is actually going to be very helpful in terms of what we do on the culture change and where we take the path to dignity and respect. But just to state again that this was done last October. And I think that those who are saying that nothing was done until February, March, we were already working on this. In fact, we were working not just on this, we were also, the minister is the one that commissioned the Fish Report to look at the military justice system. In December, the minister actually created a advisory panel and a secretariat on racism and discrimination in the Canadian Armed Forces, which again, it's another piece of the culture change that has to happen. So these are things that have been in the works for many years on top of Bill C-77, the Victims' Bill of Rights, or Declaration of Rights, on top of creating the SMRCs and doing a review of all the unfounded cases and a lot of the other things that have been done over the years. But this has been an iterative process that has been going on since 2015, since our government came into power. And I think that needs to be recognized. It has not achieved the results. And that's why we're here. And that's why we need these recommendations. And that's why we need a government response to these recommendations. So that's the path to dignity and respect. The next one recommends addressing the social factors which inhibit sexual violence reporting and challenge central tenets of the CAF. And then there's three things that are mentioned: obedience to authority, normative conformity, and group loyalty. And I noted in Mr. Bagnall's intervention that he actually said, and I think it was Dr. Okros or one of the witnesses that we heard, that he was citing when he talks about things like obedience to authority and normative conformity. And then I think this issue of group loyalty is actually something we should delve into. And these are not bad things in the military. And I think what we need to realize is that there are parts of the military culture that are actually, they're needed. This group loyalty, and again, to use a non-gendered term, what's often been referred to, the band of brothers, the brotherhood, which again, in itself shows that it is not inclusive, but that concept of being part of something bigger than you, and the concept of having each other's back. I've recently spoke to somebody to a veteran, about when you go into battle with someone, and the lifelong loyalty, the lifelong bond that comes from that no matter what, 50 years later, you still have that bond of having been through that battle and having each other's back. And you never forget. And it was a very powerful thing to hear. And having not been in the military, I've worked in places in Bosnia and Kosovo and other places where I worked alongside and saw and witnessed a lot of that culture, but the strength of that kind of bond and the loyalty and the unit, I don't think anybody wants to lose that. The problem is the flip side of that, which is that sometimes that loyalty can be twisted into protecting someone, even though they have conducted behavior that is harmful to that group and harmful to that unit and that team. And that's where I think we're when we talk about the complexities, I think that's what we're talking about. And I know that there have been people who have been saying to me and to others, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You talk about culture change. It can be frightening for some people because there are aspects of the culture that have worked, and they've worked for decades, generations. We don't want to lose that. But then you look at the other words here, normative conformity. And I think what has to be recognized is you can't have group loyalty if certain members of the group are not part of it, if the loyalty is only to some and not to others. You can't have obedience to authority if that authority is excluding, if that authority is, perpetuating behavior that is harmful. The normative conformity that we've heard about from the witnesses is very harmful to people, not just to women, not just to racialized Canadians or Indigenous Canadians or LGBTQ2. It's harmful to men who do not conform to that particular normative, because we know that within every gender, there are completely different ways in which people engage one another and behave and learn. And to only put one forward, and I think it was Mr. Bagnall, it might have been Mr. Baker, who talked about the warrior culture. To only take one form of almost a stereotype, a sort of very flat idea of behavior, and say that is what is accepted, and that all the other behavior isn't, then, to be honest, what that means is that the men who don't actually naturally conform to that very aggressive warrior culture, that masculinity, will also be excluded. So when we talk about the exclusion, when we talk about the group, when we talk about the unit, it isn't just about women, although what we know and what we've seen throughout this is the sexual harassment, the sexual violence, the assault, and all of the ways in which gender is used to minimize and diminish and to exclude from this group has a particular harm that is very unique to those who have experienced sexual violence, whether they be men or women, or trans or LGBTQ. And so we talk about exclusion from the group, we talk about harm, but then you add that sexualized nature of it. And I just want to be clear again that what we've heard from all the witnesses and what I've heard in a lot of the stakeholder engagements that I've done and those that I've spoken with recently is that it isn't about sex. It isn't about, it's about power. It's about abuse of power. And this is why in the military, and I'm going to go to the, a little bit later, we've got another recommendation here, and I might skip down to that actually. The next recommendation talks about examining how sexual misconduct interacts with consent in asymmetric professional relations. This is the key. And the first time I read this, I had to think a little bit about what this meant, because having not been in the Canadian Armed Forces myself, not having been in a military, I think this is something very unique, this asymmetric professional relations. And this is why there are certain things that are considered sexual misconduct in a military environment, but wouldn't necessarily be considered criminal or even be punished outside of the military. And it's because of the power. It's because of the asymmetric professional relations where particularly, and this is, again, I'm echoing what I've heard. I've not lived it, but I'm echoing what I've heard, that what you have are people who have so much authority. And I remember one woman saying to me that, this is somebody who had the authority to tell me when I could go to the bathroom, when I could go to sleep, what I could wear. When you have someone with that much authority over your day-to-day life, and there's such a hierarchy, then when something like this happens, it carries a very, very, it's a betrayal, but it's an abuse. It is an absolute abuse. Because even if the person in authority believes that they have consent, believes that they have that the person wants to receive this attention, it can't. It's not possible because of this asymmetric relationship that there is. And this is where I think that there's a few, and I don't know if I'll get to all of them in this intervention, but there's a few of these recommendations that talk about that kind of relationship and whether or not somebody not saying no or somebody not reporting something means that they consented in it. And, I think that it is very clear that there are occasions where fear of, because of the authority that exists, and fear of retribution, fear of career reprisals, especially, some of the people that I have spoken to were very young when these things happened to them. I spoke to some people that it happened 30, 40 years ago, and they were 19 or 20 years old. And so when your commanding officer asks you to go to their barracks or their tent, in the case of the person who called me, and you're 19 years old and there's this power differential, can you say no? And often people will laugh along with the joke or go along with the behavior and pretend that they're okay with it, but not because they're okay with it, but because they are afraid. And because there is, and I'll go back to the wording, this asymmetric professional relations. And I think it's very important that about 3 or 4 of the recommendations here refer to those words, asymmetric professional relations. And it's why when we look at military justice, when we look at the code of discipline, when we look at what is an offense in the military as opposed to in other, other day-to-day civilian life, we have to look at it differently. Because and the other thing is that we have to make sure that those in authority understand the power they have. And, I have spoken with some men who have said that they really didn't realize that the person may or may not have been willingly receiving the attention because of the way that the person may have interacted and not realizing their power. And I think we need training on how these power differentials that exist. We need to make sure that we have training on how to understand your power and not use it in a way that is going to harm others. And the level of harm, I think, has been underestimated. This has done significant harm. Like I said, when I speak to people for whom they've carried this for 30 years, and this has been with them for 30 years, that level of harm that happens, I think that we need to make sure that people in authority understand the power that they have to do harm and the impact that what their behavior does can have on people. And to go back to the group loyalty that's mentioned here, that it has an impact on the unit, on the group. Not just because you're losing talent, not just because you're losing people who could have contributed in enormous ways. And again, some of the survivors I've spoken to have said, I think I could have served my country well. I think I could have been good at this. There's a loss of the potential of what that person wanted to do to serve. And there's a loss to our country of what they could have done if they had been given the kind of environment that would have allowed them to contribute fully. So I think this is one of the most important recommendations. The next recommendation here talks about providing clarity on which aspects of CAF culture must change and which are allowed to remain the same. And again, it's very easy for us to say the culture is terrible, everything is bad. And it's a little bit dangerous because, like in the previous recommendation here, I think that.
Go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
The Liberal members have been speaking ad nauseum for quite some time. I tried to get on the speaking list earlier. Where am I on in that speaking list? Because I know we only have 5 minutes when you normally suspend these meetings instead of trying to adjourn, and that we are going to be running out of time here. And as a mover of the main motion, I'd like to speak to it before we shut off this committee before the end of this session.
So Madam Chair, I'll end my intervention here, and whatever order I think on the list, I'd be happy to make sure that others have a chance to speak.
It's Mr. Baker, Robillard, and then Bazan. That's what we have right now.
No, Madam Chair, I believe that there's no other committee meetings after 1 o'clock, and this is during the day, that there might be opportunity for more resources, and I'd like to see us extend this meeting so that we have an opportunity to fill the debate and bring this to some sort of close, at least on the amendment proposed by Mr. Bagnall.
I don't. Indeed.
Madam Chair, I'll cede the floor to Mr. Bazan.
Right. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
Well, thank you, and I want to thank Ms. Van Beld for ceding the floor and allowing us to close off this debate. This has been going on for a long time, since May 21st, as pointed out. We're in meeting number 32, and there's been ongoing suspensions, and we are now, this is the 5th meeting. We're into almost the 10th hour of debate on the amendment proposed by Mr. Bagnall, which says, quite simply, to table a comprehensive report from the government, a response to the report, if we ever get to a report. You know, all the debate that we've listened to over the last month has barely touched on the issue of the scope of the study, which was the sexual misconduct allegations against General Vance and Admiral MacDonald. And, you know, we did have a report come from the Status of Women Committee that I think all of us support the recommendations that came forward that looked at the broader context of the issues around sexual misconduct within Canadian Armed Forces. But when it comes down to the issues of ministerial accountability as it's tied to the Chief of Defence staffs, that is where the Liberals have continued to filibuster. And though, you know, we hear they don't like that term, when these minutes are finally published and people have a chance to read through, they will see that Liberals dominated this discussion, talking about recommendations from other committees, from other countries, and other studies that were not done by Parliament itself, rather than talking about the issues of trying to come to a decision on how we go forward to write a report. And that this obstructionism has not just hurt us filing a report on sexual misconduct as it relates to General Vance and Admiral MacDonald and the lack of action taken by Minister Sagen, but this also prevented us from finalizing our reports on mental health and how our Canadian Armed Forces responded to the COVID-19 crisis and were impacted by it. You know, we heard a lot of witness testimony read into the record that didn't appear at this committee. I believe that that was done as part of political grandstanding. I think it was insensitive to those victims. It's disrespectful to our armed forces. And I got to say that watching this play out, the politics play out, I've never been more disheartened being a member of this committee for the past 10 years. So, you know, how many more victims were re-traumatized by listening to their testimony read here without their permission? And then in that time frame, we know that every 3 days somebody within the Canadian Armed Forces is sexually assaulted. And because we dragged our feet and allowed this obstructionism to take place, we were not able to come to a final decision. So, you know, it's disgusting. It's egregious that Liberal members put more time into protecting the Minister of National Defence, the Honourable Harjit Sajjan, rather than protecting the women and men in uniform. And I would just say that this is complicit in the overall cover-up of sexual misconduct. You know, these ongoing suspensions is also, you know, I believe contemptuous behavior, borders on violating the privilege of all members here. But knowing that it is the top of the hour, knowing that this is the end of the session, I do now move to adjourn meeting number 32 of the Standing Committee on National Defence.
Is it the will of the committee to adjourn? Yeah. Committee adjourned.